A woman spent 12 years paying her family's bills, saving her sister from every financial disaster, and building a company that kept hospitals and restaurants from catching fire. In return, her family banned her from her own sister's wedding because they were ashamed of her work boots. But the misinvitation was just the beginning. What she discovered next involved $180,000, a forged signature, and a betrayal so deep it made the wedding look like a footnote. This is her story. My name is Caroline Shepard. I am 36 years old, and I own an electrical safety company in Austin, Texas. On the morning everything changed, I was crouched inside the kitchen of a barbecue restaurant on South Lamar, replacing a section of aluminum wiring that should have been condemned 10 years ago. The temperature outside had already climbed past 95 degrees before noon, and inside that kitchen, standing between a commercial fryer and an exhaust hood that barely worked, it felt closer to 110. My hands were covered in copper dust, and the faint smell of solder clung to my shirt the way it always does after a long job. I had been working since 5:30 in the morning because the restaurant needed to reopen by dinner, and when my crew found scorched insulation behind the wall panel, we knew we were not leaving until every wire in that kitchen was safe. That is the kind of work I do. It is not glamorous. Nobody posts it on social media, but it is the reason buildings do not burn down with people inside them. I was tightening a ground connection when my phone buzzed against the concrete floor. I almost ignored it, but something made me glance down. It was a notification from the family group chat, the one my mother Denise had created years ago to share holiday photos and birthday reminders. I wiped my hands on my jeans and picked it up. The screen filled with photographs. My younger sister Mallory was standing on a platform in a bridal boutique, turning slowly in a white gown with a cathedral train. My mother stood behind her, pressing both hands against her mouth, eyes shining. My father Walter was sitting in a velvet chair nearby, smiling in a way I had not seen in years. Cousins I barely spoke to were holding champagne glasses. Everyone was laughing. Everyone was together. Everyone except me. I scrolled through every single photograph twice, searching for some sign that I had been invited separately, that maybe my message got lost, that there was a simple explanation. There was none. I was not missing from those pictures by accident. I had been deliberately left out. I did not discover the full truth through a phone call. I discovered it the way most painful things arrive now, through social media. 2 days later, photographs from the rehearsal dinner appeared online. My parents were smiling beside Mallory and her fiancé beneath a sign that read, "Welcome to the family celebration." The entire family was represented in that room, raising glasses and laughing beneath soft golden lighting, while I sat alone in my apartment scrolling through images of a celebration I did not know was happening. When I finally called my mother, her voice carried no surprise. She told me that Mallory wanted a sophisticated atmosphere for the wedding. Nolan's colleagues were flying in from New York, San Francisco, and London. There would be investors, executives, and people who cared deeply about appearances. My work clothes, my practical lifestyle, and what she called my habit of speaking too honestly would make certain guests uncomfortable. Then she said the sentence that would follow me for months: "Just let her enjoy her big day, Caroline." I held the phone against my ear and felt something crack inside my chest, not loudly, not dramatically, but the quiet kind of breaking that happens when you realize the people you have carried for years do not even want you in the room. I asked my mother whether Mallory remembered who paid off her overdue credit cards when her event planning business collapsed, whether she remembered who covered 3 months of her rent, who sent money every single month to maintain the family duplex, a property I partly owned. My mother went silent for a long moment, and then her voice turned cold. "Do not make this about money," she said. I almost laughed out loud. They had used my money for years, but suddenly mentioning it was considered low class. I told her I would respect their decision. I would not attend, I would not interfere, and I would not clean up whatever happened next. She ended the call before I could ask about a strange banking notification still glowing on my phone, something about a scheduled disbursement connected to the family property being delayed pending updated identity verification. I did not understand it yet, but that single notification would eventually unravel everything. I stayed home on the wedding day. By that evening, footage from the reception was spreading across every local news station, and the groom's raised hand had become the image no one could forget. I quietly sat at my kitchen island, because I already knew what had pushed him over the edge. Before I explain how I knew, tell me what the weather is like where you are right now. Tell me whether it matches your mood today, and tell me where you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. 3 days after my mother confirmed that I had been deliberately excluded from my own sister's wedding, I got into my truck and drove south from Austin toward my parents' home in San Marcos. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the interstate was moving slowly through the construction zones that never seemed to end along I-35. The hill country stretched out on both sides of the highway, those familiar rolling limestone hills covered in cedar and live oak, the kind of landscape that normally calms me down when my mind is running too fast. I had spent most of the 30-minute drive rehearsing what I would say. I practiced keeping my voice steady. I practiced not raising it. I told myself I would ask questions, listen to the answers, and leave without losing control. But the moment I walked through the front door and saw stacks of wedding favor boxes lining the dining room table, white satin ribbons curling out of every one of them. Every single word I had prepared disappeared from my mind like smoke. My mother, Denise Shepherd, was standing beside the table tying ribbons around small boxes with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for things she wanted other people to admire. My father, Walter Shepherd, sat in his recliner pretending to read a golf magazine, though I noticed he had not turned a page since I walked in. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. That bothered me more than anything because it meant they had been expecting this conversation and had already decided how it would go. My mother smiled at me as though I had stopped by for sweet tea on a Sunday afternoon. "Caroline," she said, "you should have called first." I stayed near the doorway with my keys still in my hand. "I did call," I told her. "You ended the conversation before you answered me honestly." Walter folded his magazine without looking up. "Your mother already explained," he said quietly. "Mallory wants a certain atmosphere." I repeated those words back to him slowly. "A certain atmosphere. One without me in it." Denise sighed the way she always does when she wants you to feel like you are being unreasonable simply for asking a question. She reached for another ribbon and kept her hands busy while she spoke. "Please do not turn this into an interrogation," she said. "Mallory is under enormous pressure right now. Nolan's colleagues are flying in from 3 different cities. There will be investors, senior executives, and people who care very much about how things look." I glanced down at my boots. They were clean. I had wiped them down before driving over, which is something I do out of habit after every job site. That morning, I had finished a commercial inspection after my crew discovered overheated wiring inside a hotel kitchen near the airport. The work we did probably prevented a fire that could have shut down an entire wing of that building, but standing in my parents' living room, I was still the daughter who came home smelling faintly of copper and dust. "So my existence threatens the presentation," I said. Denise kept tying ribbons. "That is not what she means," Walter muttered from his chair. Before I could respond, the front door opened behind me, and Mallory walked in carrying garment bags over both arms, followed by Nolan Prescott, the man she planned to marry in less than 3 weeks. Mallory stopped the moment she saw me. Her face shifted from surprise to irritation in less than a second. "Why are you here?" she asked, not as a question, but as an accusation. "I came to hear the truth from you," I said. She handed the garment bags to our mother and crossed her arms the way she always does when she is about to say something she has already decided she will not apologize for. "Fine," she said. "The wedding is formal. Nolan's company is sponsoring part of the reception, and several of the guests attending could change our entire future. You do not enjoy those kinds of events, Caroline. You criticize everything." I asked her whether by criticize she meant that I had the habit of asking people to pay back money they borrowed. Her face turned red. "This is exactly why I do not want you there," she said. Nolan stepped forward and placed his hand on Mallory's shoulder. He looked at me with the kind of polished sympathy that people use when they want you to feel small without being able to accuse them of anything specific. "Caroline," he said, "we have a great deal of respect for what you do, but this event is really about relationship building. Some of the guests may not fully understand your line of work." I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "My company keeps hospitals, restaurants, apartment buildings, and office towers from catching fire," I said. "I employ 23 people. Every single one of them has a skill that saves lives." I did not realize that safety had become socially embarrassing. "No," and offered a thin, careful smile. "No one said embarrassing," he replied. "Mallory did," I told him. My mother stepped between us the way she has done my entire life, not to protect me, but to protect Mallory from the consequences of her own words. "Enough," Denise said. "Mallory deserves one uncomplicated day. After everything she has been through, can you not simply give her that?" Standing in that living room listening to my mother describe Mallory's life as something that had happened to her rather than something she had chosen, I felt a familiar heaviness settle into my chest. It was the same feeling I had carried since I was 14 years old, the year our kitchen pipes burst in the middle of January, and I spent an entire weekend lying on the cold tile floor learning how to replace corroded fittings while Mallory went to dance class. Nobody asked me to do it. Nobody had to. I was the one who noticed problems, and noticing problems in my family meant you were the one expected to fix them. They called me the strong one, but I understood even then that strong did not mean respected. Strong meant they believed they could place anything on my back, and I would keep walking without complaint. Every consequence of Mallory's choices had always been described as something that had happened to her rather than something she had created. Her failed event planning business happened to her. Her unpaid credit cards happened to her. The vendor lawsuits happened to her. And each time I had been expected to help because I was the stable one, the reliable one, the one who always had a solution and a savings account. I reminded them calmly that I had paid nearly $14,000 to settle one of Mallory's business disputes. I had covered 3 months of her rent when she could not make a single payment. I had sent money every month toward the family duplex, a property I partly owned and had invested in for over 12 years. Mallory rolled her eyes. "There it is," she said. "Money again. You always use money to make yourself look superior." I told her I did not use money to look superior. I used money to pay bills, that everyone else in this family pretended did not exist. Walter stood up from his chair. "Caroline, lower your voice," he said. I had not raised it, but that was the pattern. Any resistance from me, no matter how quiet, was treated as aggression. I reached into my bag and placed an envelope on the dining room table between the wedding favors. Inside was formal notice that my monthly transfers toward the duplex would stop at the end of the current billing cycle. I also requested immediate cancellation of the limited power of attorney I had signed 4 years earlier while I was traveling for work. That document had given my parents authority to pay property taxes, approve ordinary repairs, and communicate with insurance companies on my behalf while I was out of state. Nothing more. Denise froze with the ribbon half tied in her hands. "You cannot do this right now," she said, and her voice cracked in a way that did not sound like sadness. It sounded like panic. "Why not?" I asked. "Because there are expenses," she said. "What expenses?" "Property taxes, repairs, insurance." The answers came too quickly, one on top of another, as if she had been rehearsing them. Walter stared at the floor. Mallory stepped closer to me, and when she spoke her voice carried a cruelty that I will never forget. "Do not show up at the wedding later and try to rescue everyone when you start feeling guilty," she said. The sharpness of it gave me a strange kind of clarity. I looked at my sister, and for the first time in 36 years I did not feel the urge to save her from herself. "You have my word," I said. "I will not attend, I will not interfere, and I will not rescue anyone." I turned toward the door, but before I could reach it my mother called after me. "Revoking that document could make certain arrangements complicated," she said. I stopped walking. "What arrangements?" I asked. Denise glanced at Walter as something passed between them that I could not name, a look that was not confusion, but something closer to fear. Then she forced a small smile and said, "Nothing you need to worry about before the wedding." I walked out of that house and drove north on I-35 with the windows down and the hot Texas wind filling my truck, and I knew with absolute certainty that my missing wedding invitation was no longer the only secret hiding inside that family. I did not sleep well that night. I kept replaying my mother's voice in my head, the way she said that revoking the power of attorney could make certain arrangements complicated. I did not know what arrangements she was talking about, but the panic in her eyes told me it was something bigger than property taxes and roof repairs. By morning I had decided I needed to talk to someone who was not connected to my family, someone who could look at the situation clearly and tell me whether I was overreacting or whether my instincts were right. That person was my closest friend, Colette Avery. I met Colette at a quiet coffee shop near Lady Bird Lake the next morning. It was one of those small Austin places with mismatched chairs and a back patio that looked out over the trail where joggers and cyclists were already moving through the early heat. Colette worked as an event photographer and had spent years covering product launches, corporate galas, and private parties for some of the wealthiest people in Central Texas. She knew more about Austin's social scene than most publicists, and she had a photographer's eye for details that other people missed. She was already seated when I arrived with a cold brew waiting for me on the table, which is the kind of thing Colette does without being asked. I sat down and told her everything that had happened in San Marcos. She listened carefully, stirring her coffee without interrupting, the way a good friend does when she knows you need to finish before she responds. But when I repeated Nolan's comment about relationship building and how some guests might not understand my line of work, her expression changed. She set down her spoon and looked at me with the kind of steady seriousness that made the noise of the coffee shop fade into the background. "I know one relationship he has been building," she said. She reached into her bag, pulled out her laptop, and turned the screen toward me. The first photograph showed Nolan at a product launch event standing near a hotel bar with a woman in a silver dress. His hand was resting low on her back, not on her shoulder the way you might touch a colleague, but low near her waist with a familiarity that spoke of something far more than professional courtesy. The woman's face was turned toward his neck, and they were standing close enough that no reasonable person would mistake it for a casual conversation. In the next photograph, taken moments later according to the timestamp, the two of them were leaving through a side entrance of the hotel. It was after midnight. Colette clicked to another folder and showed me photographs from a second event 6 weeks later. Nolan and the same woman were sitting in a private booth at a restaurant, and beneath the table, partially hidden by the tablecloth, their hands were intertwined. I recognized the woman from Nolan's company website. She was his communications director. I stared at the screen for a long time before I spoke. "Are these public?" I asked. "No," Colette said. "They were background shots I took while covering the events." Nobody was paying attention to what was happening in the corners, but a bartender at the first event told me afterward that he watched them check into the hotel together the same night. Colette closed the laptop halfway and studied my face. "Mallory has treated you terribly," she said, "but she deserves to know what kind of man she's about to marry." My first instinct was the old one, the one I had been following my entire life. Drive to San Marcos, place the proof in Mallory's hands, sit beside her while she cried, absorb her anger until she believed me, and then help her figure out what to do next. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern. But then I remembered what Mallory had said to me in our parents' living room, the way she pointed her finger at me and told me not to show up, and try to rescue everyone. She had drawn the line herself, and for the first time I was going to respect it. I asked Colette to send me copies of the photographs with the original metadata and text so the dates and locations could be verified independently. Then, I sat in my truck in the parking lot and wrote Mallory one brief email. I included the dates, the event locations, and the photographs. I told her to verify the information before making any decisions. I did not insult Nolan. I did not mention the wedding invitation. I did not beg her to listen. I simply gave her the truth once clearly and without decoration. Her reply arrived 12 minutes later. "You cannot stand it, I am happy," she wrote. "This is pathetic, Caroline. Stay away from us." Nolan already explained that she's a colleague. Nothing more. Then she blocked me. I sat in my truck with the engine off and the Texas sun heating the windshield until the steering wheel was too hot to touch. I had offered my sister evidence that the man she was about to marry was lying to her, and she had chosen his explanation over my proof without even looking at the metadata. Colette called me a few minutes later and asked how Mallory responded. I read her the reply. Colette was quiet for a moment, then said, "You did what you could." I told her I did what was appropriate. I gave Mallory the truth once. I was not going to spend 3 weeks begging her to protect herself from a man she was determined to trust. I thought losing the wedding invitation was the most painful thing my family could do to me. I was wrong. What came next made that missing invitation feel like nothing at all. That same afternoon, I returned to my office. My operations manager, Grant Sullivan, was waiting outside the conference room with a folder in his hand and an expression I had rarely seen on his face. Grant is the kind of man who stays calm during electrical emergencies and building evacuations, so when he looks unsettled, I pay attention. "We have a problem," he said. During a routine insurance review, Grant had searched the public records connected to my ownership interest in the family duplex. What he found made him pull the county clerk's records twice to make sure he was reading them correctly. A new lien had been recorded against the property 4 months earlier. The loan amount was $180,000. I had never applied for a loan against that property. I had never authorized anyone to borrow against my ownership interest. I had never signed a single document approving any kind of debt secured by my share of that duplex. Grant placed another page in front of me. The bank file included the digital resolution that supposedly authorized my parents to use my ownership interest as collateral for the loan. There was a signature on the document that resembled mine, but Grant had compared it to my actual signatures on file and noticed that it had been copied pixel by pixel from an insurance authorization form I had signed 3 years earlier. The resolution referenced the limited power of attorney I had given my parents, the same document I had just asked to have revoked. That power of attorney allowed them to pay property taxes, approve ordinary repairs, and communicate with insurance companies while I was traveling for work. It did not permit borrowing money. It did not permit transferring ownership. It did not permit pledging my share of the property as collateral for anyone's loan. "This exceeds the authority you gave them," Grant said quietly. "It may be fraud." My hands went cold despite the heat outside. I remembered the strange banking notification from the morning I discovered I had been excluded from the wedding, the one about the scheduled disbursement connected to the duplex being delayed pending updated identity verification. Someone had been expecting more money to come through, and when the bank flagged the verification, the pipeline stalled. That notification was not a glitch. It was the first visible crack in something that had been happening behind my back for months. I called a property attorney that afternoon. On his advice, I contacted the bank's fraud department and requested an immediate hold on any funds that had not yet been disbursed. I formally revoked the power of attorney and submitted the revocation to the county clerk's office. The bank agreed to freeze the undisbursed portion of the loan while their team reviewed the file. I did not call my parents. I wanted documents before I heard their denials, and I wanted facts before I sat through another speech about family loyalty. 2 nights before the wedding, my phone rang from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message, Mallory's voice filled my ear, breathless and shaking. "Caroline," she said. I checked Nolan's tablet. "You were right. It is not only the woman. There are hotel receipts and messages about money. He thinks I do not understand what I am reading, but I do. I am going to make him tell me everything. Do not call Mom yet." I called the number back immediately, but it was already disconnected. Mallory had finally opened the door to the truth, and knowing my sister the way I do, I knew exactly how she confronted people when she felt humiliated. She did not do it quietly. She did not do it privately. She did it in the way that would cause the most damage to the person who had hurt her. Part of me wanted to drive to her house and stop her before she did something she could not take back, but I did not. She had rejected my warning, blocked me, and demanded distance. I had offered evidence and given her the chance to make a private decision. What she chose to do next belonged to her. Still, one thought followed me to bed that night and kept me staring at the ceiling until the sky outside my window started to lighten. Mallory had mentioned messages about money. I wondered whether Nolan's affair and the fraudulent loan on my property were connected. I wondered whether the wedding that excluded me had been funded by more than just borrowed by, and whether the luxury that I was too embarrassing to witness had been built on money stolen from the sister they were ashamed of. On the morning of my sister's wedding, I woke before the sun came up. The apartment was still dark, and for a few seconds, I lay there listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioning and trying to convince myself that today was just another Saturday. I pulled on running shorts and a tank top, grabbed my bicycle from the hallway, and rode out along the Anne and Roy Butler Trail that loops around Labor Lake. At that hour, the trail was almost empty. A few early joggers moved through the shadows beneath the Congress Avenue Bridge, and a single kayaker cut a silent line across the glassy surface of the water. The air was warm even before dawn, the way it always is in Austin during the summer, heavy and still holding on to the heat from the day before like it was not ready to let go. I pedaled slowly and kept my breathing steady and told myself that I was riding because I wanted exercise, not because I needed to outrun the thoughts circling inside my head. I left my phone in my bag and refused to open any social media. I did not want to see the flowers, the dress, the venue, or the smiling faces of people who had decided I was not worth a seat at the table. I rode for almost 2 hours until my legs burned and the sun was fully up, and the trail had filled with families walking dogs and couples pushing strollers, and then I went home and took a long shower and tried to fill the rest of the day with things that had nothing to do with my sister. By noon, the photographs started arriving anyway. I had forgotten to mute a group message thread from years ago, and suddenly my phone was buzzing with images sent by distant cousins and old family friends who did not know I had been excluded. The ceremony was being held at a luxury resort overlooking Lake Travis, one of those places where the hillside drops away and the water stretches out below you like a painting. White flowers covered the arch where the vows would be spoken. Glass lanterns lined both sides of the aisle, and the late morning light made everything glow as though the whole scene had been designed for a magazine cover. Mallory wore an ivory gown with a train so long it required 2 attendants to carry it behind her. Nolan stood beside her in a perfectly tailored navy suit, smiling the kind of smile that belongs to a man who believes nothing in his life has ever gone wrong, and nothing ever will. I looked at those photographs for exactly 1 minute, then I turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter and spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing safety reports from the week's job sites. I read every page twice, not because I needed to, but because I needed something to hold my attention in place. At 7 that evening, I boiled pasta, heated a jar of marinara sauce, and opened a bottle of Pinot Noir that I had been saving for no particular occasion. I sat at my kitchen island with the plate in front of me and the wine glass beside it, and the television off. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's music drifting through the wall. I told myself I was not waiting for anything. I told myself I was simply having dinner alone on a Saturday night, which was something I had done 100 times before without it meaning anything at all. At 7:43, my phone lit up with a text from Colette. 2 words: turn on the news. Before I could even type a response, my phone began vibrating continuously. Messages arrived from employees, from neighbors, from old high school classmates, from cousins I had not spoken to in years. One of them contained a video, and when I pressed play, the shaky footage filled my screen with a scene that I will never be able to unsee. The video had been recorded from a table near the dance floor. The reception was in full swing, or at least it had been moments earlier. Mallory and Nolan were standing beneath a canopy of hanging lights, but the band had stopped playing, and the guests at the nearest tables were frozen in that particular kind of silence that only happens when something has gone terribly wrong in a room full of people who expected everything to go right. Mallory was holding a microphone in one hand and Nolan's tablet in the other. Her face was flushed and her voice was shaking, but she was speaking clearly enough for every person in that ballroom to hear her. She asked Nolan, in front of his investors, his colleagues, and 300 guests, why he had booked hotel rooms with his communications director on nights when he told Mallory he was traveling alone for business. Nolan reached for the microphone, but Mallory stepped backward and held the tablet against her chest. She read one of his messages out loud, and Nolan had promised the other woman that marriage would give him access to enough family capital to stabilize his struggling company. After the next funding round, he wrote he would be free to leave. A wave of gasps moved through the ballroom like wind through tall grass. Guests raised their phones. Some stood up from their chairs. Nolan called Mallory drunk and confused, but she was neither. She opened another message and asked him still into the microphone about the duplex loan. When I heard those 2 words come out of her mouth, my entire body went still. Nolan had referred to my family's property in his private messages as bridge financing. He had written that the older sister would never investigate because she was too busy doing blue-collar work to understand what was happening with the money. Mallory looked across the ballroom toward our parents' table. Denise had gone completely pale. Walter looked like a man who had forgotten how to stand up. Mallory announced to the entire room that the wedding, the resort, the flowers, the gown, and part of Nolan's company had been funded with money taken from property that he did not own, property that belonged in part to the sister they had been too ashamed to invite. What happened next took less than 10 seconds, but those seconds changed everything. Nolan lunged forward and grabbed Mallory's wrist, trying to pull the tablet away from her. She told him to let go. He shouted that she was destroying his career, that she had planned this humiliation. Mallory pulled her hand free, and in that moment Nolan raised his arm and struck her across the face. The sound cut through the ballroom the way a single sharp note cuts through silence, and for half a second nobody moved. Then, everything happened at once. Security rushed forward from both sides of the room. A guest sitting near the front pulled Mallory backward and shielded her. Walter stood up so fast that his chair fell over behind him. Denise screamed. 2 security guards restrained Nolan, while someone near the entrance called the police. The video ended in shouting and confusion and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. I sat frozen at my kitchen island with a wine glass untouched beside my plate. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel vindicated. Mallory had insulted me, excluded me, and erased me from the most important day of her life, but nothing she had ever done to me justified what Nolan did to her in that room. His violence was entirely his own responsibility, and no amount of humiliation gave him the right to raise his hand against another person. Another clip arrived minutes later showing sheriff's deputies escorting Nolan through the resort lobby in handcuffs. Local news stations picked up the story quickly because several technology executives and social media influencers had been in attendance, and by 9 that evening the footage had spread far beyond Austin. I understood now what had pushed Nolan over the edge. Mallory had discovered the affair and the money, and she had exposed both in the room he had built to impress the people whose approval he needed most. Denise called me at 9:14 crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Caroline, you have to come right now," she said. "The police are asking questions. Reporters are outside the resort. The venue is demanding payment. Mallory needs a lawyer." In the past, every single one of those words would have sent me running for my car keys. I would have driven to the resort, paid whatever bill was waiting, found an attorney at 10 at night, managed the reporters, and carried my family through the crisis the way I had carried them through every crisis before. Instead, I asked one question. Is Mallory physically safe right now? Denise said she was with a deputy and a female resort manager in a private room. I told my mother I would send her the contact information for a domestic violence advocate and the name of an attorney who specialized in protective orders. I offered to arrange a private car to take Mallory somewhere safe for the night. Denise was quiet for a moment, and then her voice dropped to something between disbelief and anger. "That is all," she said. "Your sister was attacked in front of hundreds of people." "I know," I told her, "and I am helping her remain safe. But I am not paying the resort. I am not managing reporters, and I am not making the financial accusations disappear." There was a long pause. "This is not the time to punish us," Denise said. I told her I was not punishing anyone. I was refusing to become the emergency fund for decisions that I did not make and was never asked to approve. Later that evening, after I ended the call with my mother, Colette came over with takeout from a Thai place we both liked on East 6th Street. We sat on my couch with the television on low, watching the local news cycle through the same footage again and again. Nolan's company announced his immediate suspension pending an internal review. The resort confirmed that their security team was cooperating fully with law enforcement. A reporter standing outside the venue described the scene as one of the most dramatic wedding disruptions in recent Austin memory. Colette asked me whether I regretted not being there. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I regretted that Mallory had been hurt. I regretted that she chose a public stage instead of a private exit. But I did not regret respecting the boundaries she had demanded. I had offered her safety without surrendering my own life to do it. Near midnight, Grant called me from his home office. He had been tracking the financial trail connected to the duplex loan since the afternoon, and what he found confirmed what I had feared. Preliminary bank records showed that the first disbursement from the loan went directly to Nolan's company account. The second payment went to a wedding vendor. The third cleared a personal credit card. The wedding scandal and the fraud were not separate stories. They were the same story, and the reception was simply the moment where everything hidden became visible at once. The next morning, Grant and I met our attorney before the office officially opened. The conference room table filled with bank records, property documents, transfer confirmations, and copies of the power of attorney. As the attorney laid everything out in order, the full picture became impossible to deny. The loan had been released in stages over several months. $68,000 went to Nolan's startup under the description of a family investment. $54,000 paid for the resort, the catering, the flowers, the transportation, and Mallory's dress. More than $30,000 went to credit card balances, a luxury vehicle lease, and hotel charges that matched the dates Colette had captured in her photographs. Another portion covered taxes and closing fees. Approximately $19,000 remained undisbursed at the time I contacted the bank, and that was the money the system had flagged when the identity verification failed. My signature appeared on an electronic consent form within the loan file, but it had been copied from an insurance document I had signed 3 years earlier. The digital file was uploaded from my parents' home internet connection. My mother, Denise Shepard, had used authority that was meant for ordinary property expenses to represent me as approving a major loan against my own ownership interest without my knowledge or my consent. The attorney told me the bank had also failed to follow proper verification procedures, which did not excuse my family but created additional claims we could pursue if necessary. Later that same morning, Walter called and asked to meet me alone. We chose a diner halfway between Austin and San Marcos, a small place off the highway where neither of us was likely to run into anyone we knew. When he walked in, he was carrying a cardboard file box under one arm, and he looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of a single weekend. He did not order food. He did not make small talk. He sat down across from me and pushed the box across the table without saying a word. Inside were printed emails, text message screenshots, loan drafts, and handwritten notes. Walter admitted that he knew about the loan from the beginning. Denise had told him that Nolan needed temporary capital to stabilize his company, and that the money would be repaid in full after a major funding round closed. Mallory believed the same story. Walter said he had objected to using the duplex as collateral, but Denise assured him that I had always supported the family financially, and would probably agree once everything worked out. They never asked me, because Nolan warned them that I would slow the transaction down with attorneys and inspections and questions that would take weeks to answer. He was right, I said. I would have found every single problem in that paperwork. Walter nodded slowly without looking up. You would have found them all, he said. One email from Nolan instructed Denise to describe the loan proceeds as property improvements if I ever questioned any increased expenses. Another email noted that I was unlikely to examine county property records because I was constantly busy with work. In a third message, Nolan joked that people who spend their days repairing electrical panels rarely understand sophisticated finance. I read that line twice. The man who had called my work low class, who had told my family that I was too embarrassing to sit among his investors, had simultaneously relied on my success as proof that I was too unsophisticated to notice when I was being robbed. Walter also brought messages showing that Mallory knew the wedding was being paid from the duplex loan. She claimed she did not know that my authorization was forged, and that might have been true, but she also never once asked where the money was coming from. Comfort had made her incurious. I asked my father why he was telling me all of this now when the damage was already done. He looked through the diner window at the parking lot for a long time before he answered. When Nolan hit her, he said quietly, I saw what our excuses had built. We called Mallory fragile, so we never required her to stand on her own. We called you strong, so we believed we could place anything on your back without asking permission. He told me he would provide a sworn statement and cooperate fully with the bank investigation. I told him that regret did not erase participation, and he agreed. When I returned to Austin that afternoon, Denise was waiting in the parking lot outside my office. She did not ask whether I was all right. She demanded to know what Walter had given me. I told her he had given me enough. She insisted that Nolan had manipulated everyone and promised repayment, and that they had only tried to protect Mallory's future by stealing from mine. I asked. Denise said it was not theft because the duplex belonged to the family. I reminded her that 1/3 of that property legally belonged to me, and that I had paid for most of the major repairs over the past 12 years. She changed tactics immediately, the way she always did when facts stopped working in her favor. Mallory had been assaulted, she said. Reporters were mocking her online. Sponsors and business contacts were cutting ties. How could I possibly focus on money at a time like this? I told her that the assault and the fraud were two separate truths. Mallory did not deserve to be hit, and nothing would ever change my position on that. But the violence she suffered did not erase the financial decisions she and our parents had made with my property in my name. I handed Denise a formal legal notice revoking the power of attorney permanently and demanding the preservation of every email, text message, financial record, and electronic device connected to the loan. She stared at the document and asked whether I intended to send my own parents to prison. I told her that depended entirely on whether they continued lying. The mediation took place 3 weeks later in an Austin law office with windows overlooking the downtown skyline. I arrived with Grant, my attorney, and 3 organized binders containing every document we had collected. My parents entered together, but sat several feet apart, and I noticed they did not speak to each other or make eye contact. Mallory came with her own attorney. She wore no makeup, and a faint yellow mark was still visible along her left cheekbone. My Aunt Irene Shepard attended as a neutral family witness. Irene was Walter's older sister and had spent most of her career mediating employment disputes. She was the kind of woman who never accepted Denise's habit of calling secrecy loyalty, and her presence in that room meant something to me. A bank representative joined by video. Nolan was absent. He remained under a protective order and was being investigated for assault, misuse of company funds, and possible involvement in the fraudulent loan. My attorney presented the complete timeline, and when the numbers were laid out on the table, nobody in that room could look away from what they added up to. The bank confirmed that its fraud department had identified significant irregularities and was considering independent legal action. Denise interrupted to say that Nolan had pressured her and promised repayment. Irene turned to face her directly. Pressure is not forced, Denise, she said. You made a decision because you expected Caroline to absorb the risk the way she has absorbed every risk this family has ever created. Denise said she had acted to protect her daughter. Irene replied calmly, and without raising her voice, that she had sacrificed one daughter's property to protect another daughter's fantasy. Mallory cried, but remained seated, and did not leave the room. When it was her turn to speak, she admitted that she knew the wedding deposits came from the duplex loan. Nolan had told her the family approved an investment arrangement. She never saw my forged signature, but she also never contacted me to confirm, because she knew I would ask questions she did not want to answer. My attorney presented the settlement terms. The power of attorney would be permanently revoked and recorded with the county. My parents would acknowledge in writing that they had no authority to use my name, my credit, my signature, or my ownership interest for any purpose. The duplex would be independently appraised and sold on the open market. After the bank loan taxes and closing costs were paid, the remaining proceeds would first reimburse my documented contributions, legal fees, and losses connected to the unauthorized loan. Mallory would waive any property claim and sign a repayment agreement for the wedding expenses she had directly accepted. An independent property manager would oversee the sale until closing. Denise called the terms humiliating. I told her that humiliation was being excluded from a wedding while my property quietly paid for it. These terms were not humiliation. They were documentation. Walter signed first. His hand was shaking, but he did not argue. Denise refused for nearly an hour. She accused me of choosing money over family. The bank representative calmly explained that if mediation failed, the lender could accelerate the loan, begin foreclosure proceedings, and refer the culprit's signature for criminal review. Denise looked at Mallory for support, but Mallory did not defend her. "Mom," she said, "Caroline is not doing this to us." "We did it." Denise finally signed. Before signing her own agreement, Mallory looked across the table at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something in her eyes that was not performance. "I excluded you because Nolan was ashamed of your work," she said, "but I agree. I wanted his world so badly that I treated the person who helped me most as if she were beneath me. I'm sorry, Caroline." I believed her apology was sincere, but sincerity does not automatically restore trust. I told her I accepted that she had spoken the truth. Forgiveness would require time and consistent behavior, not words spoken in a room full of attorneys. She nodded and signed. As the meeting ended and everyone gathered their papers, Denise asked whether I felt satisfied. I did not feel triumphant. Recovered money could not erase the image of Nolan striking my sister, or the knowledge that my own mother had used my identity without permission. What I felt was steadier. I felt protected. Every promise now had a signature beside it. Every obligation had a number attached to it, and every boundary had legal force behind it. Outside the building, Irene walked with me to the parking garage. She put her hand on my arm and said something I have carried with me every day since. "Revenge tries to make another person feel your pain," she said. "What you did in that room was not revenge. It was returning responsibility to the people who created the damage." I realized, standing in that concrete garage with the Austin heat pressing against the walls, that returning responsibility was all I had ever wanted. I did not need my family to suffer. I needed them to stop making me suffer for them. 6 months passed. The seasons shifted the way they do in Central Texas, from the brutal summer heat into the brief golden window of autumn, when the evenings cooled down just enough to sit outside without sweating, and the live oaks along the trails finally stopped looking exhausted. During those months, I did not rush reconciliation. I did not force conversations. I focused on my company, my crew, and the work that had always given me a sense of purpose, even when the people closest to me could not see its value. The duplex sold in early November to a young couple who planned to renovate one unit and live in it while renting out the other. I liked them. They reminded me of the version of myself who had invested in that property 12 years earlier, full of practical optimism and the belief that hard work and careful planning could build something lasting. The sale proceeds paid the remaining balance on the fraudulent loan, cleared the property taxes, covered the legal fees for mediation, and settled the closing costs. When everything was accounted for, I recovered most of what I had originally invested, along with compensation for the unauthorized use of my ownership interest. The money did not return the years I had spent trusting people who did not deserve that trust, and it did not repair the fracture between me and my mother, but it gave me something I had not felt in a very long time. It gave me the freedom to decide on my own terms what my work and my resources would support next. I had been thinking about that decision for weeks, ever since the mediation, turning it over in my mind during long drives to job sites and quiet evenings at home. I kept coming back to something Nolan had written in one of his emails, the line about people who repair electrical panels not understanding sophisticated finance. That sentence had been meant as an insult, but it revealed something true about the way the world looked at people like me and the women I worked beside every day. Only about 3.5% of electricians in the United States are women. That number has been growing slowly, but the reality on the ground is that most women who enter the skilled trades still face an environment where their competence is questioned, their presence is treated as unusual, and their work is dismissed as something less than professional. I had lived inside that reality for my entire career, and I had built a successful company despite it. But I wanted to do more than succeed quietly. I wanted to create a path for other women to walk through the same door I've fought to open. I used a portion of the recovered funds to establish a training program through Austin Community College. The program covers certification fees, hand tools, protective equipment, and paid apprenticeships for women entering electrical work and building safety careers. I worked with the college to design a curriculum that combined classroom instruction with real job site experience, because I knew from my own life that confidence in this industry does not come from textbooks. It comes from standing inside a panel box for the first time, identifying a dangerous connection, and knowing that you have the skill to fix it before someone gets hurt. On the first day of orientation, 12 women stood inside our training facility, holding brand new tool bags. Some of them had left unstable marriages and were looking for a career that could support them and their children independently. Some were single mothers who had been working minimum wage jobs and heard about the program through a community center flyer. Others had been told their entire lives the technical work was too dirty, too difficult, or simply not appropriate for women. I stood in front of them and said the words I wish someone had said to me when I was 14 years old, lying on a cold kitchen floor, learning how to fix pipes while my sister went to dance class. Skilled labor is not low class, I told them. It requires discipline, judgment, education, and knowledge that most people never take the time to develop. It keeps homes safe, businesses open, and communities alive. No expensive suit, no job title, and no luxury wedding can make honest work less valuable than it is. A few weeks after the first orientation, Mallory visited my office. She came alone, and she had scheduled the meeting in advance, which was something she had never done before in her life. In the past, Mallory appeared when she needed something unannounced and urgent, expecting me to drop whatever I was doing. This time she arrived at the time we agreed on, sat in the chair across from my desk, and waited until I was ready to talk. She looked different, not in a way that clothing or makeup changes a person, but in the quieter way that happens when someone has stopped performing a version of themselves and started doing the harder work of figuring out who they actually are. She told me she was working full-time for a small event rental company, handling logistics and inventory, instead of trying to build another business she could not sustain. She was attending counseling twice a week. Her social media accounts were private now, and the sponsored lifestyle she once considered essential to her identity had disappeared entirely. She had filed for divorce from Nolan, even though the marriage had technically lasted only a few hours before his arrest. She placed an envelope on my desk containing her first repayment installment toward the wedding expenses she had accepted from the fraudulent loan. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out something I did not expect. It was a worn leather notebook that had belonged to our grandmother, a woman who raised 4 children on a schoolteacher's salary in a small town outside of Waco. Inside the notebook were handwritten household budget, savings goals, and notes about teaching her daughters to manage their own money and never depend entirely on anyone else for financial security. Mallory said she found it while packing up the apartment she had shared with Nolan, and she wanted me to have it because our grandmother would have understood what I did and why I did it. Mallory apologized again, simply and without defending herself or asking me to comfort her. I told her that I appreciated the notebook and that I was genuinely relieved she was safe and building a more stable life. Then I told her what our relationship would look like going forward. I would not lend money. I would not guarantee debts. I would not share account access or financial passwords. I would not respond automatically to every crisis, as though my only purpose in her life was to absorb the consequences of her choices. We would see each other because we chose to, not because guilt or obligation demanded it. If she needed help, she could ask, and I would decide based on the situation, not based on the old pattern where my answer was always yes, regardless of what it cost me. Mallory accepted every one of those conditions without argument. Before she left, she paused at the door and told me she was proud of the training program. Months earlier, she had been ashamed of my profession. Now she understood that the work she once called low class had paid employees, protected buildings, supported our family for over a decade, and was now creating opportunities for women who had been told the same lies she used to believe. That evening I came home, made a cup of coffee, and sat at my kitchen island with a journal I had started keeping after the mediation. I wrote down something I had been thinking about for a long time, something I wanted to remember on the days when the old guilt tried to pull me backward. I wrote that boundaries are not punishments. They are instructions for how people can remain in my life without harming me. Helping someone reach safety does not require rescuing them from every consequence of their own decisions. Written agreements, financial literacy, credit monitoring, and limited legal authority are not signs of distrust. They are forms of protection that every person deserves, especially the ones who have spent years being told that protecting themselves is selfish. And most importantly, family love should never demand the surrender of dignity. Nolan's public downfall captured millions of views and generated headlines for weeks, But the real ending of this story was much quieter than that. My mother could no longer use my name or my credit without my knowledge. My sister could no longer treat helplessness as a lifestyle funded by someone else's labor. My father could no longer hide behind silence, while the people around him made decisions that hurt the daughter who had always been there. And I no longer measured my worth by whether or not they invited me into rooms that had been built with my money. Sometimes the strongest response to being underestimated is not destroying the people who looked down on you. It is removing their access to your labor, your peace, and your future, and then using what you have recovered to help other people stand on their own 2 feet. If you have ever had to choose between protecting your family and protecting yourself, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to love people and still refuse to let them harm you. You are allowed to help someone reach safety without setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. Healthy love does not ask you to disappear. Your safety matters. Your dignity matters. Your future matters too. Thank you so much for watching this video and for staying with the story all the way to the end. This story is entirely fictional and was created for educational and entertainment purposes only, but the emotions in it are real. And if any part of it reminded you of your own life, I hope it also reminded you that losing people who never valued you correctly is not always a tragedy. Sometimes, it is the first sign that your life is finally making room for something better. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and subscribe to True Stories, the tragedies and comedies of life, so you never miss a new story. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share this video with them. Sometimes a single story can change the way someone sees their own situation. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one.